The winds of change are blowing. Tonight's event, titled Let's Talk About It, Women and the Presidency, is happening on the occasion of ICLA's presentation of work by artist Kathryn Andrews, which is a site-specific, occasion-specific public work on the outer facade of our museum, visible from 7th Street. And it'll be on view from now until after the presidential elections. The work was first created in 2020, and the title is very long. The title encompasses the names of all of the women who have run for the presidency, starting with Victoria Woodhull, a women's rights and suffrage advocate who ran way back in 1872. The list also includes others, such as Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress, Patsy Mink, the author of the nation's Title IX civil rights law, and Gloria La Riva, the first Latinx woman to run for president in 1992. Andrews' artwork honors these historical figures who have challenged a political system by listing them in a graphic text overlay atop of faces of widely recognizable men who have served as president, ranging from Dwight D. Eisenhower to Barack Obama to Joe Biden. It is a glaring juxtaposition that further underscores the extreme gender bias of nearly 150 years in American politics amidst persistent and systemic sexism and inequity. The work will continue to be exhibited with each election season until a woman is elected president. This event began its organization a handful of months ago when we still had 2 white male presidential candidates in the running, and the feeling was frustration around the elusiveness of having a woman considered for the presidency. Now, it's a different situation. And we want to make clear that this is not a platform for the current woman candidate. As excited as we are, we're also not there yet. Tonight is a time to take a look at what is taking the United States so long to elect a woman for president, historically, culturally, educationally, et cetera, too many excuses. And we have an amazing panel to shed critical light on this. We're presenting tonight's event in partnership with the Judith Center, and it is special thanks to Kathryn Andrews for her brilliant work of art, but also for co-constructing this panel discussion and her diligence in its preparation, a preparation that also included the important thoughts of Alberto Kiosian, ICALA's Learning and Engagement Coordinator, and our Getty Marrow summer intern, Josephine Cosmose, who's not here because she's back at Cornell. And Josephine had her research support. From the jump, we knew we wanted Artists for Democracy, a grassroots entity of artists that was created after the 2016 election, and we wanted them to bring their creative energy around voting advocacy and political engagement. Thank you, A4D, for setting up the Get Out the Vote activities tonight and introducing yourselves and your work, which we'll have someone come up in a minute. The panelists we found for this are wonderful, and we're so grateful for your openness to have this discussion at ICALA. Your time and expertise are incredibly appreciated. And who are our panelists? We have provided, this is our way, we provide these souvenir bio sheets for you, which have elaborated bios, but I will go through each of their about who they are. Kathryn Andrews is a conceptual artist who works with installation, sculpture, printmaking, and performance. Her work often highlights the way American culture normalizes unequal power structures, especially those based on race and gender. Nasreen Al-Khatib is an award-winning cinematographer whose work illuminates historically excluded voices. Her films have been featured by Apple, FX, Netflix, the Emmys, and the Tribeca Film Festival. Sarah Angevine, Associate Professor of Political Science, specializes in American politics, women and politics, comparative politics, and international relations. Her research explores how gender and identity, broadly speaking, affects democratic representation in the US. Raquel Beltran is Interim Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. Her background is in public administration, nonprofit board governance, and community and labor organizing. Natalie Masuoka, Associate Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies at UCLA. She also serves as, Faculty Director for the Asian American and Pacific Islander Policy Initiative at the UCLA Asian American Studies Research Center. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the state of ICALA right now. You have special access because we are currently preparing for our fall season with an exhibition titled Ciencia Sexualis. It is an exciting group survey of 27 contemporary artists whose work confronts, dissolves, reimagines sex and gender within the scientific apparatus. It is guest curated by co-curators Jennifer Doyle and Jean Vaccaro, and is part of an ambitious collaboration across art institutions throughout Southern California, led by the Getty Foundation and known as Pacific Standard Time, AKA PST. And this season's focus is PST, Art and Science Collide. You get a sneak peek at some of the works for our show. You might have noticed the mural outside, which is by the artist Demian Dinayazi, and it's called Pause Since 1492. And if you used our restrooms, we have another artwork installed by Chris E. Vargas called Reading is Transcendental #1. Both of these are artist activists who empower and amplify trans culture and art. Finally, concurrent with our exhibition, we will have filling these shelves our bookshelf residency with New York-based independent publisher Gender Fail, who will fill our shelves with publication by queer artists and writers. And in this little annex gallery, we will have a project with our Agency of Assets Teen Youth Fellows in partnership with Sway, an environmental activist, apparel and accessories entity in our neighborhood. And along with the project of Kathryn Andrews, it's going to be quite a season of art and wonder at ICALA. So you're getting to see it this way. Please come back. We open on October 5th, and you'll see it all filled with art. I'm inviting Mary Nemec of Artists for Democracy to come up and say a few words before we start our panel. Thank you for coming.
So as Michelle Obama said in her amazing speech at the Democratic National Convention, just do something. And so many people ask, what can I do during an election cycle? And postcarding blew into our consciousness in 2017 when activists decided there just had to be a different way to reach voters, and created this really intimate way of really one-on-one speaking to voters by writing them a postcard. When's the last time you got a postcard in the mail? And so it's become a really valuable tool in the toolkit of grassroots organizing. And I can't think of people who are better at doing this than artists, because I have an artist in my neighborhood who does postcards and they're just gorgeous. She spends time, drawing things and using color and really bringing them to life. And it's something that thousands of groups across the country are doing, and the question after a couple of years became, does it work? Because how do you know? And so a bunch of organizations started testing it. It's possible that it moves the needle from 1% to 20%, depending on the state and the race. So it's just a really great way to reach people when people throw mailers in the garbage, don't pick up their phone, to get that intimate, one-on-one, beautiful piece of really art that shows up in their mailbox can really inspire people to get out, register, vote, figure out where their polling station is, figure out who's on the ballot. So there are some packets left that you can take home and do at home. And just so you know, if you want to do this, it's such a community building activity. So you can go to mobilize.us and just look for postcard parties in your neighborhood, canvassing, phone banking, text banking. There's just so much to be done across the country. So you can find activities there, get some friends, a bottle of wine, get some postcards, and do the work. And it's really fun, it's really gratifying, and it's really just so important, especially this year. So thank you, and thank you for letting us have our activity table. So thank you so much.
Can everybody hear me, or do I need to bring the mic closer? This is better? Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Raquel Beltran, and I first want to thank you and all of your team and Artists for Democracy for inviting all of us to be here this evening. It's an exciting experience for all of us, especially on the heels of the presidential debate yesterday. It gives us a lot to think about. As you know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates. Our mission is to support informed participation in government and the decisions that government makes. And this panel is going to speak to all of that today. So we just want to make sure you know that we're not going to be talking about which candidate did the best job yesterday, but we want to have you thinking about the job and what it takes to do this, to the job of the presidency or any level of government or any kind of civic engagement that you choose to get involved with or to get others to get involved with. So we're going to open it up with some questions. We have structured questions, and then we have some open-ended questions, and then we hope that you walk away with some thinking that you didn't have when you came into the experience. So certainly we want to have that with one another too. So we're looking forward to the conversation. So this is an open question to all the panelists. Okay, so given all of your distinct perspectives, and there's a description for everybody in the handout, and thank you for doing that. Given your distinct perspectives shaped by your work and research, can you name what you see as some of the key obstacles from your areas of focus that continue to prevent women from reaching higher levels of government? And of course, when we think about that, we think about the presidency. What are your thoughts about that? Anybody can speak.
Why you don't think we've had a woman president?
And or just what obstacles there are for women. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think one of the major reasons we haven't seen a woman president is because they are the commander-in-chief, right? So we've seen some increase of women in other positions of power and leadership, but in my research, I focus on U.S. foreign policy and the role of gender stereotypes and the impact women have as foreign policy leaders, but also the obstacles it presents for women candidates trying to be experts in foreign policy. So we talk about policies having gendered, people will rate candidates as more competent in certain areas just based on their gender. And that sometimes it overlaps with party, but even when you are within the same party, people will associate the male candidate as just immediately stronger with the economy and foreign policy, and the female candidate is immediately stronger with like education, healthcare, things we associate with femininity. And so there is an implicit gender bias specifically for the office of the presidency that, I mean, we still, you know, we have like 12 women governors out of 50, so it's by no means like in any space parity. But given that it's the commander-in-chief, I would believe that's a big part of why we can't get that last hurdle.
And we see that at a local level with female mayors having to make decisions about who the chief of police is going to be for their respective levels of government, or the board of supervisors in LA County that had an all-female member of the board of supervisors battling it out with the county sheriff, who's also an elected official. So there are a lot of conversations about that. I want to make sure I mention that Nasreen was. We didn't mention that originally, but you might have something you want to contribute to this question. But I want to make sure the audience knows that she was invited to serve as the lead cinematographer for Kamala Harris's vice presidential campaign in 2020, right?
I was. I had the lucky position to follow her and document her VP campaign.
Terrific. Do you see that any of that experience that you had as it relates to the question, this open-ended question in terms of?
I mean, I would kick it back all the way to, you know, our country originates in colonialism, and that system permeates today. How we see people, how we see genders, especially how we see genders in positions of power. I think their framing has everything to do with who originally colonized this land. And how they set up positions of power for one specific type of person to sustain that position unendingly. So I think how people view that position today has everything to do with what they've been taught. As you said, Sarah, implicit bias has everything to do with how people see, can this person actually do the job? Can they do it well? Can they represent us well? And that has everything to do with who we see as powerful.
And the positions they hold. Any thoughts you want to give to all of that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, to add on to this idea of stereotypes, I mean, I think one of the important data pieces when we think about women voters, which is really more of my area of research, is that in reality, as much as we tend to stereotype politics as a man's game, or right, it's something is inherent, is stereotypically male. Women voters are actually the majority make up the majority of the voting electorate in the United States. They have actually for most of the time that we've had data. So dating all the way back through the mid 20th century, women have made up the majority of women voters and so, of all American voters. And so this is really now we can see is the real irony, right, of politics is that which gender is the most participatory when it comes to voting are women. Yet we do not see then that same type of distribution when it comes to representation and leadership.
And to think that there was a period of time, certainly early in the suffrage movement, where women could run for office, but they couldn't vote. And that happened several times, even though they represented over 50% of the population.
Right.
Your point is a good one, Natalie, that precedes sort of my thoughts about how intensely sexism is normalized within the culture. And it's internalized by women. And I think we're still struggling to figure out who we can be, not in reaction to the roles that have been prescribed for us. And the work that I made outside was really about trying to physicalize for people just how normal it is that we're like, of course there's a man there. We all know the faces. It's so familiar we don't even think it. We just breathe it. It's like it's so deeply in our the way that we think, the way that we recognize and see, and to actually put all those names up. For me, it was, and this is the second time I've made this work, and and actually, little detail, there's a few less names here because these windows are smaller, but there are more names than what are out there, and there are many. And when I saw that physicalized, I was kind of shocked. You know, it's like a history I don't carry. I don't know these names. I don't know that history well. You know, and you can go and read about, oh, I've heard a tiny bit about that or a little bit about that, but it's normal that we just accept it as a given that we're in this imbalance.
So what motivated you to do the work? And tell us a little bit about the Judith Center.
Well, the work came in response to the 2016 election cycle, where I was just so shocked by some of the rhetoric that transpired around, how far Hillary Clinton got and what it meant for a woman to be occupying that space. The Judith Center, it's a new organization, I founded, and it's really becoming active right now. We started programming in February of this year. But it was in response to my own experience as an artist, entering many factories where I would be the only woman. Maybe there would be a woman behind the desk as a secretary, but the owner, the managers, the assistants, the people really doing the very hard labor were all men. And so I would be going to these spaces. I went to these spaces for years, every single day, having to assert that I had a right to be there, that I actually was knowledgeable, I knew what I was talking about, I had financial resources, that I had earned myself to make decisions that had consequence. And fortunately, most of those people were quite respectful, but very often I faced sexism, and it was just so normal. And that's just one little tiny place where I experience in my field. It's massively rampant in the art world. So I began thinking about, to deal with this in our field, what do we need to do? And I was looking out, and I was like, well, we don't even have a woman for president. We don't. There's so many fields where women lag behind. So I began thinking, well, we need to look at this not just within our own fields, because it's hard to get traction. We know there's a problem in the art world, and there are people who have been working on this forever, like the Gorilla Girl, like all these amazing people, and yet it's still so hard to change. And so I began thinking, how can we do this? And I had the idea that it would be wonderful to begin to have dialogue with people across fields, so we could begin to understand how bias in one arena locks in its presence in others. Thus, this idea to bring this kind of grouping together of people with very different ways of encountering these dynamics, so they can exchange about it and learn more.
It's an awesome piece of work, and the great medium that you use to do that, to do the project, and I'm glad to see that it's being recognized and getting introduced in different parts. You're at Berkeley, it's at Berkeley too, isn't it?
This work, a variation of it, will be shown at the Berkeley Art Museum, and I'd like to thank Ann Elgood, the director, and Amanda Stroka, and also Aska, who spoke earlier, and all the ICA team for their wonderful support of the project.
We all
It's been
thank you
very
for that.
meaningful.
That's awesome. Great work on your part. I want to ask, kind of thinking about these mediums, I want to go back to Nasreen as a award-winning cinematographer whose work amplifies underrepresented voices. Congratulations on that accomplishment. It's an awesome accomplishment. And again, as the lead cinematographer for Kamala Harris's vice presidential campaign, I'm curious about, and I think the audience would be interested in seeing, what do you see different in 2024 than you saw in 2020? Especially when we think about women in these spaces, and we do learn how to function in these spaces, and sometimes you have to learn by experience. What do you see?
I think after the things that have happened in the last 4 years, people are framing their ideas differently, and they're pausing before they're speaking. After George Floyd, after Me Too, I think how people see women have changed inherently. How they see us in positions of power. And thank you very much for your kind words. I can't take credit for that. The things that I've been able to do in my lifetime that I've lived this far has everything to do with the women that have come before me. The generations of women who have pushed a little bit harder to get to where they were, and to have partnered with people that allowed them to take up the space that they took up. So I think the difference in the last 4 years has everything to do with how women are seen and heard and framed in the media, in film and television. Seeing Barack Obama be elected, I noticed an immediate shift in commercial television. It was some of the first times I saw multi-heritage people in Colgate commercials. And I know that seems like a small thing, but when you think about feeling like the people, the communities that you come from are represented, means that they matter to someone somewhere. And it leaves space open for you to take up space as well, whether you're in school or whether you're at your career inside your office. Having those representations permeate into commercial and artistic and television, that matters.
Right.
So seeing those micro transitions makes a little bit more space for people that were not getting any space whatsoever. And it's not just women. I mean, it goes past the binary of gender. Transgender leaders, non-binary leaders, disabled leaders, leaders of color. I mean, all of those communities
Right.
that have not been represented yet, that have not taken up space yet, are now taking up space.
Right, right. I know my husband and I talk a lot when we watch commercials, because we're old. We do talk a lot about how much that's changed. And the two things that catch our attention is you see a lot of biracial couples in commercials. Not only that, you started to go from seeing biracial couples, then you started to notice that, and even in the beginning, you didn't see black women in those commercials, but then you began to see more black women in those biracial relationships. But now what you begin to see, they were always, yes, more and more white males with non-white male partners in these commercials. So it's a quite a big change over the years. We would never have seen that in our time in the 70s. That was just, I mean, those were the days when you didn't have women in commercials wearing bra and underwear. They had the mannequins, for those of us who remember those days. You couldn't, that was considered improper to have people actually modeling these things in commercials. But going to politics, right? We're going to talk about, let Sarah talk about, with your focus on how legislation moves through Congress. Very big difference from talking about Colgate
It's
commercials.
all
I know.
representation. I had the tie-in. It was like representation.
There you go. There you go. Can you tell us why we don't see more laws passed that promote equal rights and opportunities for women? And of course, you can see my button. I'm thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment. I'll talk about that.
Sure. And as I was listening, I was thinking a great deal about this concept we talk about in political science a lot, which is also a very male-dominated game. And so whenever I'm like, I specialize in gender and politics, it's like, oh, then, people's ears turn off. And they're like, oh, okay, like, not relevant. But I was like, gender does matter, and so you always have to have the data. But the conceptual difference between descriptive and substantive representation has always been something I'm really interested in. So when we talk about descriptive, it is about like what you might see in an image, or you see a woman running for Congress. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the policy issues that woman is, advocating for. So descriptive representation is just like two-dimensional, right? Like just describing, like a commercial or I mean, maybe not a mannequin, that seems strong, but, and then what I'm interested in is how that connects to substantive representation, which is about kind of policy outcomes and things like the Equal Rights Amendment, which has been on repeat. And one of the things I find in my studies is really on Congress as an institution, as if I'm like looking at a corporation and like how do things happen inside of Congress. What affects policies that are about global women's rights is actually what I look at. But what I find is that domestic gender politics, namely about abortion, because it's the most salient issue, becomes a part of any foreign policy bill about women. So, and CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is the United Nations Global Women's Rights Treaty, which used to be paired with ERA. And it was this kind of global solidarity around, like, we're gonna have this kind of baseline as like women to be treated as humans. But CEDAW always dies, and it no longer is attached to ERA. And I still think that as long as there is traction in the electorate on the abortion issue, that as long as someone's making money, a lot of times by talking about it in some ways, this is what I found, that it really fuels the fire. And that has made a real challenge to get things passed. And if anything, you're more successful by keeping things on the down low. Like then nobody's taking time and making fundraisers about an issue, which is kind of counter what we think about democracy. I'm still a big believer, but that's how how the polarized Congress has affected substantive representation. Unless we get 60-member proof filibuster, because then it won't matter. But until then, it's really hard to get compromise in a moment that's so polarized.
Sarah, you, in some conversations with the group, you had said something about there are policies that folks have attempted to push through Congress that didn't necessarily overtly address questions of abortion, but there was the idea, it could very loosely somehow be related, and so we're going to shut it down. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
That was interesting when you talked to us about that.
The International Protecting Girls from Child Marriage Act, and this was one of the cases that was really the most eye-opening because it happens with a Democratic majority House, Democratic majority Senate. Barack Obama is president. Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. It seems to be the perfect conditions for a bill that's just going to be focused on addressing child marriage, which disproportionately affects girls. It passes the Senate unanimously. It fails in the House as a partisan move. They say that I don't want to take up too much time on all of this nuance. I'll talk about it if anybody wants more details. But basically, they implied that the bill is going to support NGOs that support reproductive health. And in that linkage, they're signaling to the members of Congress that they're going to score it. And they'll score it as the part of your abortion scorecard. And that means that if you want to show you're 100% anti-abortion, you better vote against the International Protecting Girls from Child Marriage Act, which actually had a Democratic woman sign as a co-sponsor, and then she had to vote against it because of that whip alert.
So the thing that comes to mind for me is, and also tying it back to suffrage, is that one of the arguments against giving women the right to vote was that they were going to be, if you got involved in politics, you would lose your uterus. So it's just amazing how control over a woman's uterus in many, many forms continues to happen every single day, century after century after century. So I want to move to both Sarah and Natalie and allow you to talk about, as political scientists, you think deeply about citizens' interface with systems of democracy. And I wonder if you could tell us why you see that it matters that women engage civically in their communities and in voting.
Should I give you a break, Sarah, since you...
I think Sarah could get you going. I don't know if she wants to.
Okay. I'll let her do the transition there from legislation to voter, since in political science that's quite a transition for us. So, I think when we try to make sure we think about the important difference between voting and being civically engaged, one, it's important for us to make that distinction because there are different forms that we can offer our voice to government, right? And that not necessarily means that you have to do more mainstream activities like voting, but other forms of activism such as rallying, right? Volunteering and doing other civic activities. And as although not to take your line, Raquel, but for my work, which is thinking about race and immigration, where we think about the institutions that have really systematically denied access to mainstream institutions to voters of color, and for that reason, we want to make sure we distinguish between civic engagement more broadly in voting. But I think, when we think about gender, oftentimes we want to say, well, women are really political because they're doing civic engagement, right? They may not be voting, but they're involved in their communities, which is on one hand true. But on the other hand, as I mentioned in my original comments, the important thing for us too is to try to reserve the stereotype that women are not active in mainstream politics, right? So women make up the majority of the voting electorate. And so I try to push, especially my students now, to not necessarily try to talk about the important difference between voting and civic engagement as an excuse, right, to explain that women really are in fact political, but in fact to more recognize, right, that there are different avenues for women, and women are very much demonstrating in the data to be very active in both mainstream politics, right, and in civic engagement. And so, one, I think understanding the true reality, rather than accepting some of the stereotypes, I think one is an important part of the narrative here in the conversation of the importance here of this conversation.
And I'll just add money
Yes.
as a very important way people can get civically engaged, and it's not just voting. Voting is really, really important. But the history of Emily's List, I think, is a good point to raise if you're not familiar. Emily's List, if this is like series to a classroom, anyone know what it stands for? Early money is like yeast. It makes the dough rise. And so Emily's List was really one of the first political action committees, PACs. And it was to challenge the Democratic Party because they were not being pro-choice enough. So Ellen Malcolm is like, I'm going to go find some women that will start to donate to candidates that are pro-choice Democratic women, so the Democratic Party will take us seriously. And that, from there, then we see where we are today. But it was a really substantive impact on the platform of the parties, but it was very much initiated by thinking outside of the pre-existing structure that wasn't serving this political interest. And I think, we should all take a page from that book,
Right.
and be as creative as we need to be, because hello, the system's so boring. Let's go.
And raising money is man space at that time,
Well, yeah.
especially.
Yeah, that's the other
That was
idea.
the domain of those who had that domain. We're just going to leave it at that.
Raquel, I wonder, before we move on, if you might speak for a second, because of your long history with civic engagement, to why you think this distinction between voting and being civically active is really important. You had such an interesting perspective on how that opens up certain spaces for different kinds of people who maybe can't vote.
Sure. Well, when we talk about voting, I think we have to remember that we're talking about U.S. citizens and nobody else. But when we talk about civic engagement, we're talking about a total community. And that looks different. The audience is different. Your strategies are different. And the things you talk about are different. And when you talk about civic engagement, you're talking about inclusiveness. You're talking about reaching out to folks unlike ourselves and saying, you belong in this conversation, and we want to invite you to be part of that. And it's also the case, even in voting, all the money is spent usually in all-time voters and occasional voters. But the least likely voters, which are usually the people that are just trying to get involved and trying to get started, there isn't much money spent on least likely voters. They might be the young people. I haven't seen data on it for a long time, but in the old days, they tended to be people who were younger or people of color who were just getting involved in voting during that period of time. So you're including different people. I work with a mariachi academy. We teach children music, and we teach them to go to City Hall and ask for money for the academy. And I always find, a lot of these parents, sometimes they're undocumented. You can tell by their behavior. Usually they never necessarily say something. But when I say we need to go to City Hall and we need to ask City Hall for money, the first thing they always say to me, yo también puedo ir, and I can go, and that's a way where I know that they're not necessarily feeling comfortable in terms of their legal status. It could be they're undocumented, it could be that they're legal residents, they're just not US citizens. But that response says they didn't think that was a place for them. But when they walk in, and we train the children on how to testify, I don't testify. We train them what to say. You've got 3 minutes. This is the mayor. He'll call on you. He or she will call on you. We train them in all of that. And they walk in City Hall and they walk in the council chambers, and they tickle me because they're like, they feel the power in that room. They feel the power. They look around and it's completely foreign to them. But they walk out of there realizing they can do that. And voting has nothing to do with it. They can fill that room and create some tensions and some pressure. And we encourage them to do that for their children, for their families. So thank you for allowing me to share that story. Back to Sarah.
I feel like
Back to Sarah. She got a lot to say.
no,
Go for it, Sarah. Talk about your research. Continue to talk
I
to us
think I
about
already
your
did
research.
that.
You have more you want to
I'm
say?
okay. Yeah, I'm okay.
You all right with
I
that?
just want, I'll just add that, like, from this, the question is a little bit about, like, you know, does it matter having different identities in the decision-making room? And I mean, my evidence is yes, right? So we need to have all these, you know, the diverse forms of political mobilization so we can have a diverse candidate pool that are effective at getting at the decision-making table. And then we can hopefully continue to have substantive change. Unfortunately, we need now more of a supermajority, but that maybe we can change the rules on that too.
So why did you pick the title for one of your pieces, Is Sisterhood Global?
Well, just because it was a play on Robin Morgan's book that got, there's this big conversation around national identity and U.S. as a powerful country. Like, how does one think about American foreign policy? Perhaps like it's imperial, if you think about democratic norms, the people affected by the policy have no say in how it's made. So it's got to be somewhat imperial. So how can we put something like feminism that's supposed to be about like collective solidarity inside of that context of nation states with different power? So that was why I chose the title.
All right. And for Natalie, so when you think about that, how do you, what comes to mind for you as it relates to the glass ceiling and the factors that prevent voters from making significant shifts in this area?
I think, you know, as we can see from some of my comments, you know, a lot of my work thinking about gender and politics is really trying to challenge our stereotype of what we think about, quote unquote, women voters as a group. You know, for example, one stereotype is that women are all progressive liberal voters. That stereotype in some ways comes from a data piece, which is that what we call in political science called the gender gap. And the gender gap is relative to their male counterparts. Women are more likely to identify and vote Democratic. And so when you think about the comparison relative to men, then that is where the data point comes from. However, that does not necessarily mean that all women are progressive Democrats, right? And I think in reality, we in our everyday existence know this to be the case, that politically speaking, women are not one homogenous, politically, racially, socioeconomically, right? It is not one homogenous group. That in fact, it's actually quite heterogeneous, not necessarily just in terms of demographics, but in terms of politics. Within white Americans, there are just as many white women Republicans as there are white women Democrats, right? And so I think as we're thinking and talking about a lot of the importance of progressive policies that are protecting the marginalization of women, we ask, why are these not passing? Why are we not necessarily voting for a woman candidate, right? There are also a lot of divisions even amongst women, right, about what women feel are good for women, right? So it is, as much as we think, well, women are the, make up the majority of the electorate, they're not voting as a homogenous bloc, right? And so clearly, and so this is how we see a lot of the political division that we do, particularly on gender, because even amongst women, right, there is an incredible array of conservative to political, to progressive, ideologies.
And we do that, we like to categorize people because it's easier.
Yes.
If we want them to, people don't do it anymore because it's not politically correct, but they don't ask me anymore, so what are you now? You Mexican, Chicano, what's the new word? So people don't do that anymore, but the old thinking about that is, I just want you to be one thing because it's easier for me. I don't want to have to think out that there's a whole bunch of you that think differently. You all have to think one way. And in San Diego, where I'm from, I remember we were trying to get a Latino on the city council for the first time, and they told us, you have to pick one. You can only have one. So the community itself didn't necessarily have the same ideology about what that representative needs to be like, but there had to be just one in a city as large as San Diego with a population of Latinos that was that large. So it's just easier for others to do that. So Nasreen and Kathryn, so just for context, we want you to talk about the differences in the way women's preparedness and competency for public office is measured as compared to men. And just for context, in her book, You've Come a Long Way, Maybe, kind of spin off from the old Virginia Swims cigarette commercials, Come a Long Way, Baby. Leslie Sanchez dedicates a chapter of her book, The Pressure Women Face About Their Attire. And she calls this chapter The Sisterhood of Traveling Pants, which is why I called out, the sisterhood.
The thread.
Sisterhood thing.
The thread on the pants.
That's right. But she calls them as making, as thinking about how images are created and how they circulate. So can you talk to us about that in your experiences and your observations? What does that look like and what does it mean for you?
What does it mean for me personally? I mean, growing up in Northern Virginia, I noticed being a kid of immigrants and always feeling like there were these underlying pieces of woven fabric that I didn't understand, that I had to basically investigate. I was exposed to a constant inherent bias when it came to girls and women. We are measured based on how we look first. Our body shape, our skin color, the type of fabric that we're wearing, even the silhouettes of the fabric we're wearing. All of those seem to have, whether we're talking about sports or whether we're talking about politics or whether we're talking about modeling, we are measured based on how we look first, and then measured on anything else that we're coming to the table with, our competency.
As Sarah talks about the substance.
So in that sense, we're looked at as tinsel before we're looked at as human. And I mean, in my own work, I definitely see that all the time, even today in 2024. The people who get chosen to be interviewed for documentaries, to the people who are producing those documentaries. All of those positions of power are basically, they're like these hurdles that you have to get through in order to get to the place you're going. You have to check off all these things. And if you're not someone who's non-disabled, if you're not someone who's light-skinned, if you're not someone who speaks clearly and with an American accent, all of these things end up hurting you.
What do you think?
Well, when I saw this question, I was sort of annoyed because I was like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. And it's funny looking back, I've actually made artworks about the way women have been represented in American Apparel ads, and I made sort of ridiculous spoofs on that. And but in a more sort of serious way, reflecting upon the question, I think you could ask any woman, like, what do they think about how women are commodified appearance-wise? And I think any woman can respond to that. We know that. We know that so well. It's always being fed to us. Think about your appearance. Buy these products. You're not worth it if you don't do this. And personally, I'd rather talk about how power is denied to women in the spaces where we've been excluded. And I think that's a different conversation. It's not, oh, do I look good enough? It's like, well, what's actually being talked about in the boardroom? What decisions are being made? How are those decisions being made? And I think it's a different question. And I think keeping this conversation focused on appearance is holding us back. I think we should be having different, we should be talking about different stuff.
Very interesting, but who ends up in those boardrooms? Do they check all those boxes?
Yeah, we can't just divorce it. I wish we could, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. So we're going to open up for everybody on some questions and just some thoughts. And one of them is, I'm curious about how panelists are thinking about what it means to acknowledge non-binary persons in this conversation. This question, for me, I'm going to jumpstart a little bit because it's close to home for me, because in my previous job before at the League as the general manager for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment for the city of LA, we went into a very long experience when we wanted to introduce training for the 1,700 people that serve on the neighborhood councils on gender expression, gender identity. It was a very difficult journey for us as a department because there was a strong pushback from the more influential members of the neighborhood council who are also donors and who also participate in voting for their member of the city council. And it was just education. It was just introducing it to folks, explaining to, allowing us to all recognize the biases that we all carry, all of us carry that, and how that is that we all carry it. It's not somebody else that carries it, only we all have it. We all participate in that. It was very, very challenging. What are your thoughts about that and your experiences? Go ahead, Sarah.
I can start. I think, in my research about the hostility around women's rights in American foreign policy, I conclude saying that, like, a lot of the domestic conversations were happening in foreign policy because people weren't watching what was happening there. And then, 5 years later, we have Roe v. Wade overturned from that International Protecting Girls from Child Marriage Act. So basically, able to use women in foreign countries as like a practice round because people don't pay attention back to different power roles. What was happening now, I just did a more recent study in the 115th Congress, was the anti-transgender language. So this bill called the WE Act, which is Women's Economic Empowerment and Entrepreneurship Act, will require a gender analysis of USAID, right? Which would just disaggregate how money was being spent in development by gender. And then they wanted to, and Ivanka Trump is like all behind this with like the Democratic women in Congress. There's this synthesis on women are good for the economy. There was a pushback from a group called CFAM, and they're like, we don't want it to say gender analysis. We want it to say biological sex, and like they wanted to remove the word gender from that bill and put in biological sex. So it was like another practice round, like practicing the anti-trans stuff. And Ivanka was able, I know you're like Ivanka, but she was able to get it. There was secret held, two men in the US Senate had placed secret holds on the bill. which means that no one knows why the bill isn't being talked about. Someone gets to place a secret hold, and it's done. And so she was able to get them to remove their holds and be like, oh, you're being ridiculous and stuff. But now it's amazing that it's just the same playbook. And I think one of the things we have to recognize, especially if you're committed to feminism, is this hostility around the gender identity, gender expression conversation shows you how entrenched gender is to our identity. So even if it's not necessarily one, identifying, like, wearing pants could have been, back to our traveling pants, transgender activities at the time, right? It's a very contextual thing, but its current use, I see it as a big wedge issue for power.
I want to say I think this is such an important question because I think that the ways in which women can define themselves in positions of power is so defined by men because those spaces are dominated by men. So they're always performing in a kind of reactive, defensive way. They have to put forth an identity in response to the dominant culture. And so I think the inclusion of non-binary voices is very important because it challenges women to think about more complex ways of embodying their identities. I think many non-binary persons are modeling all kinds of other ways that aren't prescribed by the dominant culture. And it helps us to get outside of that opposition.
Does your data show anything for us, Natalie?
Yeah, I was just trying to think about kind of what I can also add to this part of the conversation. Our challenge from an empirical perspective is that given such the severe opposition to recognizing non-binary gender identities is really blocking our opportunity really to fully understand the demography of our country. If we don't recognize it, which means we can't collect data on it, right? Which means then we cannot then move forward with a fuller, more systematic understanding, right, about our world. And so these battles aren't necessarily just cultural, but they're also in a deep threat to strategic threat to science, right, to knowledge production, I hope that we kind of really think about these other downstream effects, you could say too, of not recognizing other genders.
I also think it's Sarah, you're going to say something? Oh, you first.
But from some of the data, 14 to 18-year-olds or 14 to 20-year-olds, I think it's really high percentages identify as gender non-binary, much more like 20%. Right. So the future is fluid.
Yes, yes, yes.
No data anymore.
I was going to bring up a different point related to something you and I had talked about, Sarah, which is the way in which in American culture, masculinity is so deeply entrenched with ideas of dominance and militarism, and how that comes from our history, like coming from the British Empire, rejecting that, the irony of the UK has had women in power for a long time because the way power flows is through the bloodline, and yet we rejected that. We took our arms so that we could self-defend, and for whatever reasons, masculinity has therefore been so incredibly linked to that. And some of what you were bringing up in our conversation, Sarah, was the role of the U.S. as this international police force, and so how we struggle to divorce ourselves from our relationship to guns. And I think it's such a tough relationship to break, and because it is almost irrevocably, it's impossible to break it. It locks in an idea about masculinity that the other genders can only be constructed around.
as evidenced in the debate last night, if anyone watched the comments about, I've got a gun too.
And so does my vice president.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all like that type of thing. Do you have thoughts for us?
I have so many thoughts. I don't know where to.
Know where to start or end.
I could talk all night about, masculinity, how it's defined, where it originates from, and it was a topic that I was always dismantling and reconstructing in my own mind when with my sisters, because my father comes from a very small Iraqi town where masculinity was defined by John Wayne movies.
Green Berets, yeah. We grew up yeah.
And a multiracial mom who taught me feminist history and speaking publicly, and so two very different opposing definitions of what masculinity is and how it should be defined and who gets to make the decision about how to define that. But I think, as someone sort of on the outside of that looking in, I don't know that any of my male counterparts growing up or my cousins today ever stopped to think about, how do I define my masculinity? Like, where did I learn these concepts from? And are they mine? Do I have to continue to persist on this? So yeah, I don't know
Do you see any of
where.
that changing in cinematography and that profession in the industry?
The amount of women and women of color and non-binary people in cinematography are very few. Generally, the rooms I'm a part of, much like Kathryn said, I'm the only one. I'm the only woman of color there. Many times I'm the only woman. So when I have the chance to build out my own teams, that changes, obviously. But when I don't have the chance to build out my own teams, it's lonely. And the space that I feel like I can take up shrinks tremendously, because there's this sort of like unspoken thing where you're lucky to be here. You're lucky we even let you in this far. How much are you going to talk now? So
what role do you see men having in changing the imbalance? And this is a question for everybody.
how do I think men can change that imbalance?
What role do you think they have?
I mean, what I can speak to are the conversations I'm having with my male colleagues, my male identifying colleagues, which is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear that they're feeling about not realizing that they've taken up the space that they've taken up. And then there's a whole other contingent of knowing exactly how much space they've taken up and wanting to continue that, wanting to sustain that legacy for as long as possible. So for the contingent, for the population who's curious, who does feel that fear, but the fear from wanting to grow, it's usually the conversation that they're having with women and non-binary folks and trans folks who they feel comfortable enough to be wrong with.
So, like, in my gender studies courses, and I have a few, like, male-identified students, I'm always kind of making the pitch that patriarchy kills men, right? Like, at the most basic level, you have an investment in redefining this structure that, I mean, there's a lot of research on how and why are men conscripted to be on the front lines for the armed services, like how we've socialized that. And then heart attacks, right? Like literally women live longer, right? And how the stress of a lot of the expectations around patriarchy are a huge weight for men. And so everybody, we have to just kind of look at this as it's a joint problem so we can have a more collective solution.
I was sharing, go ahead, please.
I was going to add, I have another identity as a psychotherapist, and I think about this in that world as really having so much to do with generational trauma. You know, as women are put down, as they're not able to access the same kind of financial resources, you know, as they raise their children on their own in a system which isn't supporting them, you know, boys pay, men pay, and that's carried forward. And so I would say to men, like, let's just think about this really selfishly. Like, you don't have to be selfless. Like, look at the cost to you of your mother having experienced that, or your sisters, or your child. You know, there's a real price, I think, that men pay for this imbalance. Psychologically, financially, practically, like on every level, health-wise, so on and so forth. Sorry, Raquel.
And one more like fun fact, the men in Congress with daughters are more proactive on a lot of gender equity policy,
once, yeah.
even across both parties.
I think I remember reading that once. I would offer to the audience, I shared with the panel, just as a coincidence, and I didn't get paid for this plug, and it's not about that at all. But I just happened to be hearing a podcast, a Washington Post podcast. They have a show called Impromptu. And this particular one episode or segment was called What Do Men Want? And at first when I heard it, I wasn't really interested. I was in the car, so in LA we listen to everything in the car, or in California. But so at first I thought it was going to be one of like Mel Gibson coming in doing some kind of thing like that, but it's nothing like that actually. So I highly encourage you to listen to it. I'm going to send it to my son and all the men in my family and my daughters to listen to. But it really speaks to all of this in a very, very deep way. It's the research they did is awesome, but the way they packaged it up and put it together, they speak to all of this in contemporary times. And I certainly identified with it because they included in the segment what is happening for males within certain ages that are still living at home. What is going on with them? How are they feeling? How is that affecting them? And then they pull in data to talk about some of those pieces. So it was wide ranging, and I encourage you to take a look at it and listen to it, because I'm going to listen to it again. So a couple of things I want to just talk about, and I think we're ready to wrap up a little bit and allow all of us to give some closing thoughts, is I really like kind of where we've landed now when we talk about, you know, the burden that we place on one population for being all the things that we expect them to be in this. And I'm going to just kind of read a couple pieces that I thought would be good kind of food for thought for all of us. This is an excerpt from a book written by Camille Stivers. It's called Gender, Images, and Public Administration, which is kind of the field. We've talked a lot about political science, but when you talk about government and the administration of government, you're talking about public administration. And in this piece, she talks about public administration theories. It's all sciences have their theories. That changes in thinking can affect changes in material circumstances. That developing an understanding of the connections between habits of thought and societal arrangements between ideas and values in public administration and systematic inequities in conditions of people's lives can lead human beings to take concrete actions that will change things for the better. And the whole point to all of this is these structures in the public administration were designed and constructed by men. And in that construct, their views about women meant that women had to be in a particular place in the field of public administration. So I thought a lot about this when I watched the debate last night, because certainly as the head of the executive branch of government, you're looking at a presidential candidate and a woman who is really having to deal with these kinds of structures that have been there for certainly a long time. So we want to be able to leave all of you with our last thoughts about what we think we all want to think about and challenge ourselves to do as we walk out this evening. And we hope that you've learned some things, and we hope that you'll be able to share some things that we brought to the table in order to get all of us thinking about what our civic space is going to be and where we want to be in all of that. And certainly for the League of Women Voters, it is just to get involved, just be a participant, be where you can be. I worry about people who worry about doing too much. Last night, we administered for the league elections for the city's housing authority. So those are the 13 public housing developments that the city owns and operates. They have residents advisory council. So those are people, that's the working poor. And a woman came up to me last night and said, I really want to run for this position here, but I have 2 children, and she talked about, the challenges and balance. So I remember telling her, just do what you can. Do what's comfortable. Do what makes you feel like you've done something. Don't pressure yourself into doing something that makes you unhappy. Being involved civically should be fun. Whatever you choose to do, make sure it's fun, and do bring your family along with you, because it's an example that you set for others. So that's my thought for you. What thoughts would you all like to leave?
I think the question on the table is like, what concrete actions can we take to make a difference in this question of moving the needle? For me, it would be, let's stop normalizing sexism. Let's just call it out. Let's just bring it back to the table as a topic. Like, it's real, it's everywhere. It's so intricately linked to these incredibly important conversations about race we've started having in the last few years, and now gender identity and everything else. And I think tonight we've woven a lot of the relationships, we've made those visible. So I'd say, like, let's just talk about it. Talk about it more. Don't be afraid to bring it up.
Others?
I think when we think about politics, one of the main questions is, kind of what explains why people get involved, and one of the basic questions is that they feel really individually and personally motivated, right, to get involved. And I think moving the needle, my takeaway would be not for our candidates, our leaders, right, not to think about women as a homogenous, monolithic group, that they're actually quite diverse. And connecting with women voters isn't about giving some stereotypical one-line, right, kind of messages to activate women, but women actually really have a really diverse set of interests. And so in recognizing that individuality, recognizing that diversity is the way that we're going to activate the targeted parts of the women electorate that you really want to turn out for you.
Nourish yourself. I just feel like, and I'm gonna add with the information you put into your brain is as important as the food on your plate. So try to intentionally direct your attention to things that nourish you. And that, I hope, will include some policy information. And you can go to congress.gov and look at stuff, and 538 or on the media.
That's right.
We're still post-COVID, we're still COVID-y, and we've forgotten, or I don't know, we've really been denied that the strength, the magic of interactions face-to-face with humans. And so as much as possible, find ways to do that in ways that nourish you, like book clubs or just dinner.
Good points, good points. What would you share?
I think about privilege a lot, and I'm not just talking about racial privilege or gender privilege. Whether you have an apparent disability or not, I would encourage folks, and I encourage myself, to think about how I'm using the privilege that I'm utilizing, because everyone in this room, everyone hearing this, everyone eventually seeing this online has privilege in some way. How are you using that privilege? Are you using it for yourself or just your family? Are you using it for your community or all of your communities? How could you potentially take what you have and share it to make things a little bit more equal?
Nasreen, one question about that, because you had used that word in a way that I thought was interesting in a conversation we had had earlier. And I think often that word now gets thrown around to mean, oh, you have privilege, that's bad. And I was struck by the way you were using it as having so much to do with I exist and I can exist and I can take up space. Can you speak to that a moment more?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should define privilege. And right now, just as a person sitting here, I have the privilege of a microphone illuminating my voice to people that are sitting in the back. I have the privilege of sight and smell. I have the privilege of having a degree and an American mother who taught me the underlying language underneath English. So when I speak about privilege, I'm speaking about all kinds of privilege, age privilege, pretty privilege, economic privilege. And I think, Kathryn, what you were speaking of is, can you ask the question again? Sorry.
Well,
I'm also
I think now sometimes that word gets used almost apologetically, and I think
Yeah.
you're using it a little bit differently, where you're encouraging people to proactively use their privilege to make a difference.
Yeah, it's not bad when I say privilege. I was a part of this art project in DC years back, and one of the things that we collectively came up with was check your privilege. And that can mean like you're in a conversation with people and there's something that makes you uncomfortable that you didn't know about, to just move towards that discomfort and dismantle some of the privilege that you've had that never exposed you to the perspective that you're hearing or you're listening about. So yeah, I don't see privilege as a bad word. I see it as a tool. It's a tool that's been imparted to me. It's something that's been imparted. All of us have it. You can't pretend like it doesn't exist. It exists. It exists everywhere, in every city, in every town, in every room, on every street. So the question is, when you start to actually measure that privilege and figure out who has privilege, how are they using it, who is benefiting from that privilege? I think that's what I'm very curious about.
That's great context. Yeah, I'm glad you asked her to clarify that. It's very different than the concept of elitism that is oftentimes associated with privilege. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We're happy you're here with us.